All right, Ava, feel free to unmute yourself. Okay, great. And
Hi.
hi, welcome. I'm Kelly. It's nice to meet you, kind of in the internet land. And Amana is my co-host here.
Hey, Eva,
Hi, so nice to meet you
thanks
guys.
for meeting with us. And thanks for
Yes.
letting us record. We have a lot of people who want to finish the book because we always promote spoilers here. So they wait until they finish and they watch the recording.
Sounds great.
This is such a powerful and thought-provoking story, and it was so fun to discuss this with readers because there's just so many different points of discussion and so much nuance. I really
Mm.
can't think of another book that raises so many questions in such a nuanced way. So congratulations on this incredible release, and I'm so excited to hear from you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Yeah, it's exciting to be here talking to you guys. It's been really interesting to hear the different ways in which people are reading the book. There are obviously, you know, a lot of different perspectives in the book, and readers are coming away with a lot of different perspectives as well, I think.
Yeah, I think the story lends itself to that type of discussion and just people walking away with different things.
Yeah.
What do you I will say, how did you get the inspiration for this story? I saw that you started it a long time ago when you were pregnant with your first child, and it took a while to work through this. So, what was the initial inspiration?
Yeah, it took so long. This is the longest I've ever worked on um, a book or any kind of project. I think it felt especially long because it was the first years of my children's lives. So to go from being pregnant to now having my 6-year-old first grader, it feels like, oh, like I have an actual measurement of
Yeah.
how long this book took to write. So when I first got the idea for it, it was actually during the 2016 election cycle. So it was interesting to have it come out now. I think,
Right.
you know, when it was released in September, it seemed like maybe we were going to be in a different place after this most recent election cycle, and we're in a very similar place, not the same, but similar. But at that moment, I think social media had recently taken off as kind of the new sort of public square. Um, Around, a couple years before was like when Twitter and Instagram and everything were becoming like sites of conversation. And we were experiencing, I think it's not that they were new divides in our culture, but they were becoming visible in different ways. And part of, what I wanted to do with this book was to sort of try to find a way to, empathize with the people on the other side of any of the many battle lines we've drawn, and to kind of, look for the human beings behind the headlines. I think even as I've, in the years since, things have become even more kind of black and white, like just as a general statement. It's like you're on this side or that side, like you're this or you're that. And when we edit out the complexity from our conversations and the gray areas, I think we miss a lot of the humanity. There are shades of black and white in our culture, certainly. you know there are monsters, but most people aren't monsters, and I think many stories live in gray areas, and have more than one side. Then we don't always get to hear all the sides of the story, or we're not always listening for the like complexity and the humanity on the other side of something. So that was the sort of overarching project of the book for me, I guess. That's
You
like
did
the macro lens.
you did I mean, we were just talking before you hopped on here about how you really did. I don't know how you did it to make it so fitting where I could see both sides. And I didn't think that that would be possible because I'm like, well, if someone thinks that they were raped, then that's, I'm siding with her right away. And
Yeah.
I mean, through getting to know Noah too, it's just a lot of layers of everything. Not to say that I like fully loved him, but I could see all of their flaws. And it was just, I don't even know how you did the writing here. Was it like a whole, you know, to tie them all in together too? I mean, I can't imagine how hard that was. I don't know how.
It took, yeah, that took a long time. It's interesting. Yeah, I love that you say that. I don't think it's always about like, fully loving somebody, right? Or fully siding with
Right.
them or thinking that they're, innocent or perfect. It's just about seeing, the complex human being and circumstances, behind different situations. Like when I started, I mean, when I got the idea for the book, it was actually it was just before the Me Too movement had really like taken off. And I think in a way it's good that it took a long time to write because I don't necessarily think it would have been like the right book to come out like at the beginning of that because it that was really like a moment of women kind of reclaiming our power and our voices, right? So I don't think there was space right away to like, talk about that kind of complexity. But I think as like we are moving through the years and seeing some really important changes, seeing some, rightful justice, we're also like seeing the way in which things aren't changing like how we would like them to. And I think from my perspective, being able to start having like conversations about the nuances are one of the ways that we might move forward. I like have had, the experiences of most of the women in the book. And so, you know, it was really messy for me to write too. Like it was emotional and took a lot of, you know, time and processing and all of that.
Yeah, that's a vulnerable place to go for you in a story. And just to open yourself up as an author to like readers' interpretations and even me as a reader, I was like, what's she trying to say here? Is she trying to, is she saying that like we shouldn't believe women? And I'm like, I know that's not true at all, but like it just like does raise up some uncomfortable questions in readers. And I loved that about the book. But I can see how as an author, like to get to that point would be not easy.
Absolutely. And I think and hope that when people read the book, they will like see it the way you're seeing it and see that, it really is about the complexity. It's not about saying, don't believe,
Yeah.
like remotely. But I think if people just hear, one of the things that made it scary for me to write was like the fear that if people just heard, the glancing summary of the book or like what it's about or multiple sides of the sexual assault allegation, that it would be, triggering for some or that they might assume,
Mhm.
you know, that I was, mm, taking a side that was problematic.
Mhm.
You wrote that scene so delicately. I feel like that evening between Noah and Juliet, because we got to hear the background. First we knew that they met up, but then through getting to know them, and then finally towards the end, getting that evening given to us, I was like, oh, how's she going to do this? How is this going to go? Because I
Yeah.
don't know how you're going to make me still then see both sides. And I was reading that section thinking, oh my gosh, I'm here, I'm there, I see her, I see him. It was, yeah, it's such a bold, powerful move. I haven't really read a book that took on that big topic just so openly, but so delicately. Um, yeah, it was really powerful.
Thank you. I wrote that scene like pretty early on when I started the book because I was like, well, I have to know if I can do like I have to
Oh,
know if
right,
I can do this, like if it's
right,
possible to see this from more than one side for the thing to work. So
right.
I tackled that like within the first months.
Getting to
And
know
then
all
I
of those,
revised it countless times, but like the essence
right.
is basically the same. And one of the things that I found while writing that I think is like, for me, part of the conversation of it is that, I think that as women, many of us are familiar with what it feels like to dissociate, and then, there's implications of Juliet's own history of trauma that, preceded Noah. But for me, what was interesting was like part of the discovery of writing that scene is like, oh, he's checked out too. Like they're both dissociating, and that's how they're living it. Like that's how they're having two different experiences and like living in two different realities in that moment.
Mhm.
And to get their whole background stories before that was so helpful too, because knowing where you come from and what you've been through added to that scene so much.
Yeah.
Do you feel like your history as a screenwriter and your time in LA helped shape like that scene in particular, or just your writing in general? I'd be curious to know about that.
Um, oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, of course, my experience in LA and Hollywood is very much infused in the book, and a lot of
Can you
Noah's
talk
like,
about that? Because some people
yeah,
might not know, like, what experience did you have?
yeah. So I actually got an MFA in poetry after graduating college. It was a sort of um, twisty journey, but I graduated college from the University of Chicago, where Noah and Juliet go. Um, I thought I wanted to do a PhD. My mom died that summer, and I was like, broken and totally lost interest in the PhD route. But the one thing that I did still love or could still do was write poetry. Like that felt like the only language in which I could kind of express my grief. So I followed an ex-boyfriend to LA, like in the interim, because I just like needed to get out of my childhood home. And I'd known him for like a few months. I was just like 22 and like, okay, cool. Like, I guess I'll go here. It was where I was born. My parents had this whole like history in LA. So it felt in a way like I was like searching for my mom's, like,
Mhm.
there was this like other part of her that I was discovering while I was here by like going to the farmer's market they used to go to, the beach in Malibu, the restaurant where they had their date. And so that really like contributed to the way in which I fell in love with the city. And I left for a couple years. I did my MFA program for poetry, and then I came back to LA, like thinking, realizing I'd have to try to make a living and thinking I'd give screenwriting a shot. And I was so brand new, in that first year and then the years afterwards, like I just didn't know like what was legitimate, what wasn't. Like I did like work for a producer that I loosely based Noah's producer on for a couple of years. He was not, I feel bad because like he wasn't a bad guy at all. It was just like it was a crazy experience though. Um, and yeah, I drive like I still in my first year here, like I didn't have an iPhone or GPS yet. And so I'd like have the giant LA Thomas map, like trying to like drive to these like crazy houses in the valley to like tutor kids and SATs. Like I did everything. And then I eventually started working for Stephen Chbosky, the author of Perks of Being a Wallflower, which was made into a movie. And so he's a screenwriter and a director and a novelist. And when I gave him my first attempt at a screenplay, he suggested I write a novel. And I did write my first novel afterwards. And continued working as his assistant for several more years, but eventually I quit when I got the chance to adapt it into a screenplay. But yeah, that feeling of like possibility in LA and longing and desire, and like Steve was the best boss, like such a kind person, really like showed up for me when the book came out. And yet, like, I will never forget just like the palpable like longing after like years of like getting his dry cleaning and like his mail and paying his bills and getting it like putting away his groceries and all of that stuff, just like wanting so badly to like break through and be seen and be an artist myself and all of that. So that's infused. And then my husband, like we met when we were both assistants, and we had, some of the Noah Jesse inspiration came from our early days as, both trying to become writers together. And yeah.
Yeah, Melissa in the chat said that makes sense as Noah's journey felt so raw and real.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was almost hard to read. Like my stomach just did flips so many times of like his journey to try to make it. You could just see how excruciating it can be to try to rise up in LA. I mean, it seems so hard.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you threw in the baby for Jesse, I was like, oh my God, I can't. It was like so spot on. I was like, when I had my babies, I felt all those things, and I didn't have my husband being decimated in the social media world I mean, it was just very, just like took your breath away, of just like anxious feelings. It was so real.
Thank you.
Yeah, and even just
Yeah,
that.
I was living through those early postpartum days, like during part of the writing, so I had it right at my fingertips.
Yeah, it was very, very real.
And just how your personal identity gets wrapped up in your work in a
Yeah.
way with like,
Yeah.
I am not an artist at all. And so I'm not speaking from experience here, but I just feel like the arts lends itself more of like giving of yourself to your work and how the lines can get blurred between like your career and like who you are as a person and like your identity and what you feel your worth and value is.
Yeah, that's a great insight. I think that's like absolutely something that many writers and artists and and maybe others too struggle with. Like you don't always know where's the line between who am I, like who I am and what my work is. And Noah's feeling of like needing to, I mean, at the end of the book, like leaving him like still with a life and a family and without the thing that's defined him forever and like been his drive forever was, I don't know, like that felt like the right place to leave him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
As the author, do you feel like that was justice for Juliet? Like that was enough, not enough? Like we were talking about, like, what does that look like? What does justice in a situation like this look like? Like cancel, is it enough to be canceled even when she's not here to see that play out? Like, is it just a broader question or, like making an example of him for women in general? Like what do you think?
That's such a good question and a hard one.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, I th- I think in like in the situation of the book, which I always want to be careful to say is like not a stand-in for every
Yes, of course.
for
Yes.
every situation is so specific, and there are many situations that don't have the kind of gray area that exists here, and there are many situations, you know, I don't know, like I felt bad for Noah, honestly, like
Yeah.
I felt sad that he lost
Hmm.
that life. Like, I don't know that I would say I also felt bad for Annie. Like, I equally, I guess my editor said this and I felt like it was the right thing. Is she was like, when you get there at the end, like it feels like it plays out as a double tragedy, which is sort of
Hmm.
how I see the book.
Yeah.
Like, it couldn't have been anything but a tragedy.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I think there's like hope for Annie that she'll, process her grief and find a life that, is authentic to her at the end. But there's also the reality that like that grief is never going to go away.
Hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Her befriending Jesse was so special and
Yeah.
did give some hope. Like that was such a hopeful bond that they had. And it was short, but just like could probably last them the rest of their lives to give them some peace.
Yeah. Yeah. If I continued, I will never write a sequel. The book ends where it ends, but like I would have had them. I feel like they find each other. Like, I don't feel like they never speak again.
Yeah. Yeah.
I felt like that relationship, which sort of surprised me, it was like one of the surprises of the writing, where it's like, oh, they're gonna meet. Like, this is,
Uh,
but it speaks so much, I think, to like how they just happen to be on opposite sides.
yeah.
And like there were so many ways in which they could have been, best friends. Like,
Right.
Melissa in the chat was wondering if you always plan to have that connection in mind.
I didn't. It was something that I discovered while I was in the writing process. Um, I'm a pretty, it's part of why probably it takes me so long. I don't really like outline a whole lot because I sort of have to like write everything to know who the characters are. I'll have like certain, like I knew what the subject of the book was. I wrote that scene that I mentioned like early on. Um, but a lot of like who the characters are and what happens and how their lives unfold was sort of a process of discovery while I was writing.
And the bouncing back between the years, how did you keep track of all of that? Because I listened to the audio, but then I luckily had the book too, so I could I opened the book to be sure that I was in the right time frame.
I was like really adamant because I'm somebody when I read, like I get confused really easily and I like being able to refer to the years and
Uh,
um no. So I was like, my editor asked a few times, like, do we really need this every, and I was like, yes, like they
Yeah.
have to know. They have to be able to open the, like, look back and know exactly when it is. Like, I would want
it
that.
was so helpful.
Yeah, structuring the book was a heavy lift that we were working on right up until the end. My editor was really helpful with that. My first novel, or not my first, sorry, my second novel goes back and forth in time between a mom and a daughter when they're both 17. So it also has like these two time periods and these two parallel stories. And I wrote them both separately and then cut them together. And I was like, oh my God, it's magic. It works perfectly. Like it's like a movie, like film cutting. And so I was sort of like hoping that would just happen with exposure, but it didn't really. It was a lot more complicated. There's obviously more perspectives, more time periods. And it took a lot of work to even figure out like, okay, where does it start? Like what,
Yeah.
just to make it unfold, to not give everything away right away, but to allow it to unfold with maximum momentum. Because you obviously have to be somewhat patient as a reader before the stories intersect.
Hmm.
And I felt strongly that, like, those years of knowing the characters were so important to the book. Like, you had to know
Right.
who they were and what they'd been through and who the people in their lives were in order to like for the book to work, in order to actually be able to empathize with them. Um, but it takes patience. So for that first half of the book not to feel too slow took a lot of work about like, how quickly to cut back and forth in time, I didn't always start the book where it starts. There was like a point when I started it, like with Noah on his press tour.
Mm.
You like knew what the accusation was from the beginning, but then that felt like, okay, there's no reveal really. So it took a minute to sort of for everything to fall into place. But I'm pretty happy with how it came out.
Yeah, I think you're right. And we were talking about that in book club. Like you had to have that background for the characters. Like there's no way around it. Like you just needed time with them to feel that. And so I think that was smart on your part. We were talking in book club, especially Ivana was noticing the poetry and how it sounded so poetic. And so to hear you say that you are a poet, I mean, that really that makes a lot of sense.
Shines through so much. And we have to talk about the grief is and the grief is, because we were saying if we could just have it outlined, like all the sayings you had with that, like that clearly had to be a special part for you, right? To pick and choose where to place those and how to place them. And we were wondering if they were particular to each character, or was it more just your visions about grief?
Um, yeah, I think they're particular to like the moment that each character is in when it arises, but it is a little bit of a is it still italicized in the book? It's not anymore.
Yes.
No.
It
I
used to be, I used to have them all in italics because I did kind of think of it as like a sort of like slightly outside voice, like a slightly other voice. Um, but then ultimately I think it sort of like took you out of it to italicize them, so we didn't. But yeah, that was something that kind of like arose organically for me when I was writing, and probably that kind of like repetition and that way of playing with language does come from my background in poetry.
Did you purposefully like sprinkle it through? Because I felt like some parts I could feel it way more than other parts. Like when Noah's mom gets her
Her bit, yeah.
section,
Yeah.
it felt very, very poetic. And Melissa said too, when maybe it was, yeah, the audio was just beautifully read. When Juliet is also going into the water, that whole scene of her was very poetic feeling. Didn't know if you like specifically zeroed in on your poetic side on certain parts or just kind of let it flow throughout.
I just kind of let it flow throughout. I think one thing that stayed, a couple of things that stayed with me from the years I spent studying poetry. One is the like importance of every single word, because a poem only has every word carries so much weight. But I think I've kind of like carried that sense of the weight of every word. And then the music of language, like so much of poetry is about rhythm and it's about music. Like when I was teaching poetry, I would tell my students that poetry is like a song with the music and lyrics in one. Like part of the meaning of the words comes from the way they sound.
Mm.
And so I think I've just, and not really even in a conscious way, but in like a subconscious way, probably carried that like sense of like I need things to sound a certain way. Like when I'm editing, a lot of like if there's like a word that echoes that's not like echoing in a musical way, but like just in a repet, like a lot of it is like how does something sound, and I'll hear things and I want the language to be like, I don't know, flowy,
Yeah.
musical.
Yeah, we noticed that the structure of some of your sentences sometimes were like a little on the shorter side, and like it gives it kind of this rhythm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
Yeah.
that
And
part is kind of intentional, I think.
Yeah.
yeah, they pack a real punch, even just the shortest sentences. Yeah, Melissa says, do you read your work out loud?
I actually use a PDF reader. So it's like a robot voice, but you just get used to it and you don't hear it anymore. But a lot of the way I edit when I have looked at something on the page for too long and like need to hear it fresh is I would like go on hikes and have the book, like listen to the book in my headphones. And so that is part of, I mean, I hear it when I read it just in my head, but like having that sort of like different way of encountering it was definitely really helpful to me.
That's so interesting. I don't know if we've had an author that has shared that they use that strategy. That's so cool.
It's like the best tool for editing, in my opinion, because everyone gets to a point where you're just like so bleary eyed. You're like, I can't read this chapter again, you know,
Yes.
or for structuring the book. Like, you really have to hear the whole, like, you got to do the whole thing when you make structural changes because it has ripple effects. But,
Mhm.
like, you know, like, you don't want to read your whole book again for the
Yeah.
sixth time to see if it works. So, listening to it can kind of like help you know how things are playing structurally without, I don't know.
So for this book, did you do what you did with your second novel as far as writing each character's perspective out the whole time and then splicing them together? Is that what you did here too?
Yeah.
Wow.
I have like I use Scrivener to write, so you can have like all your like each little chapter is its own like document on the side, and you can easily just like move them around so you're not like cutting and pasting in a big
Uh,
Word doc. And so I'd have like all the chapters, but I had like all of Annie and Juliet, and then like all of Noah and Jesse, and then I had like the Chicago years.
wow. So that is a lot of moving parts when you
And
make
a
a
lot of
change.
moving parts. Yeah.
Literally, yes. Wow. Okay. Um, that's so interesting to think about. So, will you talk a little bit about why you decided to include the perspectives that you did?
Yeah. I mean, so I started, the original conceit of the book was to hear this particular story from both Noah and Juliet's sides, so to speak, like to see both of their points of view. And when I started writing, like Annie just kind of like quickly showed up, I guess. Um, and I felt like there was something valuable in getting to know and see Noah and Juliet through the eyes of the people that love them. Like, it added a layer of like being able to empathize, I think. And then, you know, they're both, it's like not just the people involved who are affected by these things, right? Like, I would, when I read headlines and stuff, I would like think about like, what is it like for the wife, you know, like what is, you know, I don't know. So I was like, I was interested and curious to see Jesse's side of it, but I also felt like knowing her was sort of essential to knowing Noah. Same with Annie, like I wanted to know like who she was, how did she see it, like what, she broke the story, so like what made her make that choice, how did it unfold. um so yeah, and I think like, you know, you don't get a lot of, you get more of Annie's voice in the book than you do Juliet's, which when I was first writing it, you didn't really get Juliet's point of view till later, because I like didn't have that whole section until much later in the book. But because she's absent, you know, because she's deceased, like she doesn't have a voice for a lot of it. Like, she's relying on her friend, but then I think it's really important that when we get to that time, we see it through her eyes, through how it what like how it felt for her.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Wow.
like her voice is being kind of like excavated or something.
Yeah. Yeah. And her memories. And we were talking too in book club about the unreliability of memory and how tricky that can be will you talk a little bit more about just your perspective on the unreliability of memory and like if there, I'm wondering if there was like a research process involved in like memories or like were you looking into some other cases or like what did that look like for you?
Just therapy.
Okay, great. That's perfect. Yes.
um, yes, obviously memory is so unreliable, and yet there are like I think what is not unreliable is like the emotional truth of something.
Mm.
Like you can, your brain can do all kinds of things with details of scenes, but like your body knows, you know what I mean? And so that's kind of like what I was working with.
Yeah. That's very authentic to the situation then. Yeah, you didn't need to go digging into these other things. I think that therapy can reveal a lot of truths for us. So,
We also talked about Juliet and her death and how, did she drown just naturally? Did she commit suicide? Did you mean to leave it sort of up to the readers to infer, or was there a clear, you know, we all read the book at different points of time, so people were trying to remember if there was like a definite way that she drowned or, you know.
I left it ambiguous on purpose, because I think it was ambiguous for her.
Mhm.
Like I think it was in between. Like I don't think it was like a very clearly planned, like I'm going to kill myself now. But I think there was an element of like,
Mhm.
she'd just been so thrown out of her body. And she, I think, was kind of like just disembodied in a way at that time that like didn't let her make a clear choice. And then she had also obviously just lost her mom, who was, the central figure for her life and her identity. And so I think there was like a longing for her mother, to find her mother, to be with her mother. Um,
Mhm.
so I think there are like a bunch of complex factors that played into that also was like made it not quite black and white.
yeah,
That makes
that
that.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We were wondering too, like, is this another nuanced situation where it depends on, each person's perspective? Like from Annie's perspective, like, of course, this was so intentional and so planned. And, from Noah's perspective, like, hey, I thought we had something going here. Like, this had to be an accident. And, so it's just something interesting to consider too. Mm, really powerful scene.
Thanks.
Will you talk to us a little bit about the theme of just exposure and the tie-in with photography? And we were talking about the cover and just how fitting the title is for the story and how cool the cover is and just like how it makes you just consider that connection between that things are gray.
Yeah. Yeah. The shades of gray are well represented on the cover of the book,
Yeah.
like alongside this kind of like, you know, bold, loud. Um, so the title of the book did not arrive until the book was done. It was actually,
Oh.
yeah. Um, my agent, I wish I could take credit, but I can't. He thought of it. He was actually pitching me a different title, and then mentioned this and like exposure and like in passing. And I was like, no, that's it. Yes, that's the one. Like, I love one word titles. For this book in particular, I loved a one word title because there's so much in the book that like I feel like less is more when you're trying to encompass the spectrum of it. So it obviously relates to photography, exposure, the way that images make meaning in our world and our lives, the way that stories can be exposed at different times, the kind of exposure that Noah was seeking in his life, like as an artist, versus, the kind of exposure that he got, the story that was exposed. So it
Mhm.
has all of these different like layers to it, I think, the title.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about exposure in the sense that like what he had done was exposed. I was just thinking like purely from the photography standpoint of like how you can look at like the same picture and just see something different. That's interesting. I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah. And the photography element of the book was um that that story with Juliet and her mom and Annie, I think, was intentionally sort of playing into those gray areas of consent, like questions around, could Juliet, as like a small child, consent to being part of these photographs? Could she not? Was it a good thing for her? Was it damaging? All of these sort of, it was loosely inspired by Sally Mann's work. That's how I imagined Margot's photos. She's a photographer who took pictures of her own children that are like, to my eyes at least, these stunningly beautiful documents of childhood. Like they just capture the essence of childhood like nothing else I've seen. But there are, many, she's written her own memoir and has her own things to say on it, but there have always been a lot of questions surrounding her work about like the morality of it. So I was playing with that a little bit in the Margot storyline. And also just the different like meanings the images can have in different contexts. Like you have this one image of Juliet in a gallery that is one thing at a certain time, and then you have it on the internet circulating the internet all these years later in relation to this scandal that's broken. So I was playing with that too, like the way that we make meaning through images and the way that meaning can shift and be seen through different sort of points of view.
Oh, Melissa, she said she's got a comment more than a question, but go ahead, Melissa.
Hi. I listened to your book. It was really it was a fascinating listening experience because I think we talked a little bit about how just listening it felt very poetic. But one of the things that I remember listening to and hearing, and I wish I had bookmarked it because it was pretty kind of a heavy moment, and yet it really struck a nerve. And I don't remember if it was Juliet or Annie talking about, I think it was maybe Juliet, just talking about how like growing up or being in your younger women's stage and not being a, you know, fully sexually active yet, but doing all these other things that we don't consider sex yet or whatever. And it was fascinating to read how like we would do this because it kept us out of a worse situation. We would do this there were all of these like background reasons for why women or young women were were kind of not really giving consent to, but feeling like, well, if I do this, then maybe I'll at least avoid that and it'll get me out of this situation. It was just really interesting to me to read that level of things, and it was very familiar to my own
Yeah.
personal experience.
I've
So,
had more women comment like so many women note like hone in on that
mhm.
those couple paragraphs in the book, I think, because it's an experience that many of us share. That ambivalence that you about your sexuality when you're first coming into it, for Annie and Juliet, that was young. I mean, maybe that exists less so if you sort of come into your sexuality later, but I think for teenage girls, like it's really common to like, you know, to have a lot of ambivalence around it, to not really know if they're consenting or not consenting, like to like it, to want it, to not, to want to escape, like, you know, all of these mixed feelings and mixed motivations and mixed desires. That was my experience when I was young, certainly. And I felt like it was important to at least like touch on that, because it started before Noah, right? Like he was
Yeah.
like this, it's like it's such a deep background, I think, of like how female sexuality gets conditioned, that like
Yes.
allows for the kind of situation, or at least contributes to the kind of situation that happens later.
Yeah.
Happens later to
That's
Juliet.
that's a good word that you said, conditioned. That felt like exactly, yeah, a perfect description of that scenario. So I did appreciate that. I thought that was um it was telling, because you don't really see that kind of stuff in a lot of writing. It's I think a lot of like coming of age novels talk about those first experiences, and it's all this either, wonderful bliss, or it's this, devastating experience. And sometimes it's this weird mix,
Yeah.
and you don't really know what it was until you're
Yeah.
older. 20 years later, you look back and you're like, oh my gosh, that was actually worse than I remembered.
Yep. Like that line about, you know, sometimes they give blowjobs because it's the easiest way out of the back of a car, which is, you know, it's a fucked up line, but like, I think it speaks to that feeling of like, well, they're choosing to do it right, but like they're doing it because they feel coerced or under pressure or afraid that if they don't, like,
It
they're
would be worse.
afraid of this underlying, exactly, that it would be worse. And then what is it in them that like makes them repeat that and want to and be there or like be there in the first place or go back, you know, that is not in any way like, that is like very separate. Like I don't want to conflate that with an experience of rape or of like, you know, anything like that. But I do think that that sort of, yeah, ambivalence is the best word I have for it, that many women experience when they're coming into their sexuality is real. Like, I mean, also just as a parent now, I'm like, kids are not meant to have sex. Like, you should, like, everyone should be like a full adult, you know.
No areas in
Not
between.
ready, their brains are not ready, they can't process it.
Yeah. We were talking about that too, just in our book club discussion. Like, I'm a mom to three little boys. And so, like, what is my responsibility as a parent to talk with them, and like at what point, and like, who bears the responsibility like more? And we were thinking like it's Ivana was saying like it's the boys, it's the men, like we've got to start with them because like they are the problem. And and just like what conversations do we need to have with like our daughters or nieces about consent and like communicating and things. And so I do think your book raises interesting questions for parents or like caregivers of young adults, and what conversations have to happen.
Yeah, I have a girl and a boy. And it is interesting to think about. Like, I feel encouraged by the way, like, I feel like the younger generations, like, active consent is much more, is like a concept that's understood. And that's, you know, that's really the only way to do it, I think.
More
But yet, at
talk
the same
about.
time, yeah, like, I think, you know, it has to be like a yes means yes, so that everybody knows that they're there because they want to be there. But, you know, sexuality and sexual desire like works in strange and hard to pin down ways sometimes, and it can still get messy. And it seems like, you know, as I was talking actually even to some of the young women from ZB Books when I was in New York. Like, is it different? Like for you guys, do you have these experiences? Do you know people who've had these experiences? And it seems like it's not as different as, as we'd hope it was.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
But I think continuing to talk about it is definitely one thing we can do.
How has promoting your book been going with, with like you said, Zibby, and you've gone to New York, and have you done more stops along the way? And have the people all been kind? Have there been any things that have like surprised you?
By and large, people have been really kind and interested. Yeah, I went to New York and a few other, New Jersey and Connecticut, and then I went to Colorado, where my sister lives, and Albuquerque, where I grew up, and Chicago. And so it was really fun. It was like strange. It's so vulnerable to have something that you've worked on for so long in the world. You wait for so long for them, like there's so many feelings that go along with it. Like I feel so exposed. Um, and yet, like, I so want people to find and read the book, and you wonder if they will, and you put so much into it. So there's just a lot of like sort of mixed feelings. I think also because I had my dad was dying when my daughter was young, and he died when she was like 15 months old. And then COVID, there was COVID, like not quite, less than a year later. And then just, early parenthood, like I really felt like I've been in hiding. Like I just withdrew sort of in a way, or like retreated from the world in a lot of ways. So this has been, I've joked, it's like me coming out of my cave, having this book come out.
Yeah, in
So
a
that's
big way. It's not just like a
yeah, I know.
casual. It's like
You wrote an amazing book, and that time that you were in your cage like that. That's such an
Yeah,
amazing product for all the things you were experiencing at the same time.
thank you. Yeah, it was my way of processing a lot of it.
Mhm. Yeah. And to spend so much time with these characters and these pages, like that, the time that you spent feels well spent. From the reader, we can tell the time that you took with each character and your word choices and how thoughtful of a book it is. That comes through.
Thank you. That means a lot to me.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you hope readers take away from this story? I know you've kind of touched on like you just want more discussion and around this topic. Anything else that comes to mind as far as what you hope readers will walk away with when they finish your book?
I hope that even, beyond the difficult topics that are tackled within the book, that it in general might help somebody walk away with like more empathy for or curiosity about people who think differently than we do, uh, or who like are on the other side.
Mhm.
Um, I think that can be a really hard ask sometimes, like in the world that we're living in.
Yeah.
For me too, we all, I think when we show up to social media, for example, if we're like, interacting with politics or, other hot topics, or even in our lives, like it's just structurally like it triggers our fight or flight response because we feel like we're fighting for our beliefs, our safety, our family safety, so many things that are so real and palpable and necessary to fight for. I think when when our nervous systems are heightened like that, we get tunnel vision. Like that's a known thing. Your vision narrows both literally and cognitively, and that's one of the body's survival mechanisms. So like I like, even if you sit there and like try to look out the sides of your eyes, you can feel your body relax a little because you're shifting into this like different state. So that's kind of a metaphor and also just kind of a reality. Like I think reading is one way in which we can like downshift the nervous system and like be in a different pace and a different, you know, mode, and be more able to take in different points of view or like complexity, a wider perspective. And so I guess my hope is for this book to contribute to that and to give people a little bit of a lingering, you know, like wider vision. I don't like, I'm not asking anybody to give up, you know, their fights and their morals and their beliefs. It's more just like, you know, if we flatten people who think differently than we do, then we're starting to dehumanize them, and that's how we can, you know, be at war.
Yeah. I think that there couldn't be a better time for this book to be out in the world. I think it was like meant to come out when it was meant to come out. Like it's perfect timing, right on time.
Thank you.
Can you
Yeah.
share anything about what you're working on now? Is there, you know, another book coming? Are you able to share anything?
I'm doing like a fun little sort of, I do have another book that I'm working on, that's a motherhood book, I guess.
Yeah.
In the thick of early motherhood, it's like two young women who were lovers in an MFA program and then had this like fallout and then meet again 20 years later when their youngest children attend this fancy preschool together in LA.
Hmm.
And they're anyway, I won't go too far into it.
Yeah.
Who knows if I go through with it or not? It's still in the very early stages. And then I'm also adapting my first novel into a graphic novel, which is just
Oh,
like a fun sort of palate cleanse of a project for me.
yeah. That's so cool that you can go back and revisit like a book that is so special to you and characters again and like just play that out in a different format. How cool.
Yeah, it kind of like came out of nowhere. I wasn't really seeking it, but somebody reached out, and then my agent was like, well, why don't we just ask Macmillan if they want to do it? And they did. So it's kind of like a new fun format, but I think it's close enough to screenwriting that I'll be able to get the hang of it. And then it'll be fun to see like somebody else's
Yeah.
art to go with it.
Yeah, that's so cool. So before we wrap up, I've got to know what authors or books you've read recently that you've really loved. You have any off the top?
Um,
You
I'm
can
reading
cheat and look at
Didion and
your.
Babbitts right now.
Say that again?
It's called Didion and Babbitts. It's about
Okay.
Jeff Didion and Eve Babbitt.
Oh,
And it's great. I'm like so into it. It's like LA and the, you know, early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. I've just kind of, I'm only a little way in, but I'm sort of a cliche Joan Didion, you know, super fan. So it's fun for me.
yeah, that's awesome. Anything else that you've read lately that you've loved?
I read God of the Woods recently, which was, you know, I think it's popular for a reason. It's really
Yeah.
good.
Did you appreciate the timelines of,
Yes, I was like, and the way she laid it out with like
yes, an actual
folding
line?
like day 4 of it. Like I was like,
Yes,
all right, they really got it down. Like
yes. She had that.
so many timelines, and you always knew just when you were.
I know. I appreciated that too. I love that. Uh, okay, well, we are just so thankful that you were able to join us tonight and that you just shared so much of yourself with us and your book. It's really so beautiful. We're so excited for you and excited to cheer you on with whatever comes next for you.
Thank you. I'm so grateful that you guys, you know, picked this to talk about and had me on
Yeah.
here. Like
So
I
much
said, like you release a book and you don't know, like, is anyone reading it? Is it affect, like, do people like it? Do they not? What do they think? Is it making its way
everyone
into
that
the
we've
world?
talked to that's read it has had nothing but powerful, great things to say about it, that it truly like touched them and it was just like they couldn't wait to talk to somebody about it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can we grab a
Yeah.
quick picture if you've got your book
Oh yeah.
available?
One sec.
Ivana, you got this?
Okay. Yeah, I do.
Aw,
Got
cute.
her. All right, ready? One, two, smile. Got it.
The
We'll put that.
audiobook's really, the reader's really good for the audiobook, right? I really liked her.
Yes, the narrator's great. Yes, she
When they
was.
sent samples, I like hated them all except loved her. I mean, I
Ooh,
didn't hate them all, but I'd like one for one set like voice, but then thought they didn't work for the other. And she was the
Right.
one that was like, oh, she can do both, like she could do both.
Yes,
she was a
yes,
clear winner.
she was
Yeah.
great.
Aw, that's awesome. Well, thank you again, Ava. We're so thankful you joined us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Bye.
Thanks.
You.
So good luck with everything.
Thank you.